Hello everyone, I'm Alex and this is Generation Vatican II, where we try to understand what exactly was said in the Second Vatican Council and how it affects our lives. So welcome to Generation Vatican II. I'm your host, Alex Clark, and with me today is Mr. Suan Sonna. Suan Sonna is a Baptist convert to Catholicism and founder and host of the Intellectual Catholicism podcast. Note the name change. He has appeared on podcasts like Pints with Aquinas, Capturing Christianity, Gospel Simplicity, Catholic Answers Live, and the Council of Trent, and now Generation Vatican II, and many more. Suan is primarily known for his research into the historical and biblical roots of the Catholic magisterium, especially the papacy. He has a BA in philosophy from Kansas State University. Suan, welcome to Generation Vatican II.
Thank you for having me.
Dude, it is so great to have you on. So like we were talking about beforehand, you just kind of like stumbled upon me, which I think is fantastic. We reached out, got the interview set up. So this is going to be a little different from kind of your bread and butter. Like we said in your intro, you're like the it guy for the papacy now. But what I really was interested in, you've talked a lot about that wonderfully on other places, Council of Trent, Pints with Aquinas. I've really enjoyed your interviews there. I don't mean to rehash a lot of what you've said there. We can definitely talk about it. But really, I'd like to talk with you about, at least first off, your time with the Dominicans. Mm-hmm. So you recently were let me get this straight, like a third order brother in the Dominicans. Am I getting that right?
So I was a novice in the Dominican order.
Okay.
I don't know if they would count it as like any order in particular, you know? So for example, I would be called Brother Suan Sonna, but I couldn't receive the OP title because technically we weren't officially in the order just yet. We were kind of in our trial period, if you will.
Okay. So you were a novice. And there's usually a timeline associated with being a novice. About how long was that?
So it'd be a year.
A year. And how long were you in the novice program?
So I was in the pre-novitiate for 1 month, and then I was in the novitiate for 3 months.
Okay. I'm sorry. You said OP. Forgive me. What does OP stand for?
So like technically the official name of the Dominicans is the Order of Preachers.
Okay. OP, hence.
Yeah.
Gotcha. All right, cool. So what first drew you to the Dominicans?
So I think from the very, moment that I converted to Catholicism almost 3 years ago now, I was always attracted to St. Thomas Aquinas. He had a very close place in my heart, and he ended up becoming my confirmation saint. And from there, I started feeling a call to maybe spiritual fatherhood. And the idea of religious life started really attracting me on multiple levels, especially in terms of how they live a very simple life. And also I had one Dominican priest explain to me that, the vows, chastity, poverty, and obedience that the religious take, that we're all called to take in our own specific way, the evangelical councils as they're otherwise known. These vows are really marriage vows to God, and that through religious life, you can actually, in a really extraordinary way, be married to God. And so that idea really attracted me. And that's what got me discerning for like 2 years if I wanted to be in the order or not. And I decided to go ahead with it.
Nice. Yeah. In my little research here, I have found such an immense and fantastic emphasis on the evangelical councils. I think it was the I'm blanking on the name of it. It was the Apophthegmata Patrum, which was like sayings of the desert's fathers, which kind of like detailed the first 500 years of these hermits that lived out in the desert, just like extreme dedication to the three evangelical councils and how they lived such wonderfully holy lives. I think that's really something that, isn't focused on in the lay life,
yeah,
but really needs to be brought in more.
I mean, that
Would you?
was the universal call of holiness, right? So,
Yeah.
somebody might say, like, let's say you're married, how can I live out poverty, chastity, and obedience, right? Well, I mean, for example, poverty is just the idea that you don't live beyond what you really need, and that whatever excess you have goes to the poor or to charity, right? And so, for example, as a father, if you have children, right, for you, poverty is not going to look like sharing, well, it might look like sharing everything in common with your wife and your kids, but it's not going to look like, for example, not having any property at all. You need the property to
Yeah.
feed the kids and take care of the wife and keep her happy and all that. In terms of chastity, right, you're not called to celibacy, obviously, if you're married. But chastity in terms of, for example, being loyal to your wife, having fidelity in emotional relationships with other women, other things like that sort. And then when it comes to obedience, recognizing that as you as a husband, you have to be obedient to your wife in a way out of love, right? And
Absolutely.
when God calls you to, let's say, do something with your family, like maybe go to a new church or, a new parish, I should say, or, just do something radical that he's calling you to, then you have to show obedience to God, right? Because he's the ultimate authority to which you answer to.
Hmm.
And so, these are different ways in which you, even as a married person, or me as a single person to some extent, can live out the evangelical counsels.
So we've talked a bit about the parallels between like how this happens in secular life in a marital relationship,
Yeah.
and then you even mentioned that you felt a call to spiritual fatherhood.
Hmm.
Now, it seems like you were drawn to the Dominicans in that you had an understanding of marriage and then thought you wanted to apply that to a spiritual life. Yes?
Hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So I want to ask about that because I think that's the prominent and prevalent way that people understand the religious life. Hey, I understand marriage, and from that I can kind of abstract out to a religious life. Uh, did you ever end up reading uh, there was that book that Pope Benedict and Cardinal Sarah wrote
Oh, I know
together?
what you're talking about. Yeah, something like the silence of our hearts or something like that, or I forget.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Hmm.
It was effectively like a defense of chastity in
Hmm.
in the priesthood. In that, Pope Benedict makes the claim that it's actually the opposite way, that marriage only makes sense insofar as the priesthood is a marriage to God. Have you ever
Mm.
encountered that before?
I've encountered priests who have said, yeah, like their life is really a marriage to God. And so,
Hmm.
but not like the reverse. I think that's interesting. Yeah. And also I should mention too that I received that book actually at a priestly discernment retreat, but I didn't get the chance to read
Okay.
it.
Okay. Yeah, I read it maybe a year ago now, and I just remember that part stuck out a lot to me because it's really surprising, and it,
Hmm.
it it almost like doesn't make sense. Of course, Benedict, the scholar, he writes it in such a way that's like, yeah, yeah, I'm right here with you. I get it, man. You make so much sense. And even now, a year later, I can't rephrase how he said it, but it's definitely like I think it's something worth delving into where it's like, no, actually, marriage to God first,
Hmm.
and then from that we have this mirroring, this reflection of God's love in the family, which is a beautiful way to think about, and I guess an accurate way to think about human love.
Right.
Yeah. Hmm.
Well, I mean, because God is the highest good, and so I forget what exactly the name is of this particular principle, but there's this idea that if you pursue God first, because He is the highest good, He can order then all the other lower goods like family, our vocation, right, and properly order them. But for example, if you place something lower than God above God, then your whole system is disordered, and so you can't achieve the peace that you're seeking.
Hmm. Just to talk a little more about spiritual fatherhood, one thing that's discussed a lot in various writings is that, like, regardless of your state in life, you are always called to, between us men, fatherhood,
Yeah,
biological
right.
fatherhood or spiritual fatherhood. So, and then same for women, biological motherhood or spiritual motherhood. And by or, I mean and or, because
Yeah.
you can be a biological and a spiritual mother. Anyway, so talk to me a little bit about your desire for spiritual fatherhood.
I think it came about when I was altar serving, and obviously, like that's the role of altar serving to prepare, young men for the priesthood and to get them kind of near the sacrament in that
Hmm.
way. And I remember just when I would, distribute the Eucharist, just the powerful feeling that I had that I want to do this for the rest of my life, and I want to take care of God's children in this way, and feed them with the food of immortality, as I think Saint Ignatius put it. And so that really had a powerful impact on me. And I started talking to my priest and started going to kind of discernment retreats, and it felt really right to me. And I prayed with God, and I thought this is the next step. And I will say that though I discerned out, I really do feel like I really feel like God led me to go into the novitiate. So it wasn't, for example, wasted time or me just being self-deluded.
Hmm. Hmm. So you think that although you are not ultimately a Dominican now,
Mhm.
that still was a necessary point in your life that has helped develop you into uh, your fullness of development in Christ as Suan Sonna.
Yeah, I mean, with religious life, you so many parts of you are poked at, and kind of you start seeing, your flaws in a more clear way. You see what holiness really looks like and how painful holiness really is. And that experience in the with the Dominicans, it really helped me learn more about myself. Especially because when like all of us, right, when we're in our everyday lives and routines and we kind of are fairly comfortable, we think we're good people. And when I entered into the Dominican order and we went on this silent retreat, before our vestition, before we received our habits, the white and the black, um, that silent retreat kicked my butt because during that time, all these things that you thought you had worked on, all these things that you thought you had mastered, they start coming out in really like, visceral ways in the silence. And you're like, you can't do anything about it. You can't distract yourself. You can't use sound, right? Because it's a silent retreat or anything like that. And so for me, I think what I valued about my time with the Dominicans is that it helped me look more into myself, learn more about myself. And I ultimately came out, I think, as a more complete person.
Hmm. Hmm. How do you mean a more complete person?
So in terms of like understanding who I am, and I mean, this kind of gets into why, I guess I can talk about how I discerned out. So I think I discerned out for three reasons. The first is just while I was there, I had a lack of inner peace. So even though there were moments that I really enjoyed, like, one of the thing I missed the most about being a Dominican was wearing the habit, because when you wore the habit, it really was a ministry in and of itself. So, for example, I'd wake up in the morning and maybe I was irritated with a brother from last night who really annoyed me, right? I don't know, maybe he used the toaster for too long, or he wanted to watch one movie, I wanted to watch another movie, whatever. Petty silly stuff. And I wake up, I put on the habit, I look in the mirror, and I realize I can't let this pull me down. I'm called to something greater. So the habit would minister to you. And then when you go out on the street, people look at you, people come up to you with their stories about their life. You go and like, I did work in a women's homeless shelter, and the women would talk about how they would always, some of them would feel really uncomfortable when men would walk in.
Where are you for this?
Oh, Denver, Colorado.
Okay.
Yeah. So, some women would feel really uncomfortable if they saw like men walking into the homeless shelter. But because we were in our habits, they recognized that there was something different about us, and they could trust us and open up to us. So I really loved, wearing the habit. But at the same time, though, I didn't have inner peace. And I remember the Dominicans, they really stressed to me, like, Swan, you have a great, let's say, intellectual life, but we need to work on the heart, right? So what do you feel? What do you have emotionally? And so what I did was I began going before the Blessed Sacrament on four different occasions. I would do the spiritual exercise where I would turn off my mind and I would let my heart speak. And every time that happened on the four different occasions, my heart would say, Swan, I'm not here anymore. I'm not here. And then my mind would come in, no, no, you got to stay Swan because the habit looks really cool. You discern this for 2 years. This is the calling of your life. What are people going to think if you leave? And I was like, well, no, my heart's gone, right? The second thing was just realizing that at a certain point, if I just tried to force myself to stay, it would be inauthentic. And I know that that's not what God wants from me, to not be who I am truly in Him. The third and final thing was we did these kind of psychology workshops where we got to learn more about our personalities, especially because in religious life, if you're living in a community with people, you want to know, like, okay, if my friend is an, I don't know, an INTJ, which I am, then how does that shape the way he approaches conflicts, right? So to help community life. Well, I took my personality test and it came out that I'm a very kind of independent, entrepreneurial type of person. So I really need creative space. I really need the freedom to some extent to call the shots, right? Like, and obedience isn't a problem for me. Like, obviously, like if the church told me I'm wrong on something, I'm gonna obey. I trust the church. I don't have a problem with authority, right? So I'm not like some edgy teenager. Um, but I realized that for me, there's a real entrepreneurial spirit there that I felt like couldn't necessarily fit well in religious life. So those are the three reasons why I left.
Gotcha. Entrepreneurial spirit. Okay. That's interesting that they had you do a personality workshop with the MBTI, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator
Mhm.
test. I find that very surprising, actually.
Well, I mean, I thought it was a really good exercise, and they're trying to use the best resources that they can to probe
Uh-huh.
into our personalities and help us learn more about ourselves.
Yeah, I
It
know
was
it's
the workshop was led by a Catholic woman, so
uh-huh.
mhm.
Yeah. I know it's yeah, there's nothing like I don't think there's anything bad like from Catholicism about it. It's just uh so I have to do it for my job as well. And I know that it's used a lot in like corporate America. Um, it's just that I think in the past, I don't know, 5 or 10 years, there's been a bit of backlash against the MBTI because it's a good exercise to go through, like you said, and it is a tool to have in your pocket. Like in my day to day life, I am an TJ or what ENTF, I think that's mine. It's like that's good for you, but then it's also kind of been shown to be kind of pseudo-scientific. Again, a
Mhm.
good tool to have, but not the best. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But that's interesting to hear that you were, let's say, uh, you were more outgoing to such a degree and desiring of your own company, corporate status that like it would not work within a religious order,
Mm.
which is a bit more like bring it in now, like pray with God and
Mhm.
there's not much going on outside of like, well, what movie are we going to watch tonight? And there's your
Mhm.
work you do at the monastery. So that's okay. Yeah, that sounds like a good reason. Cool.
I will add though that like religious life is really like the military in a lot of
Okay.
ways, and I wasn't. I mean, I feel like I should have known that, but like it definitely is in terms of just like superiors doing what you're told, that sort of thing.
Very
I mean, so
regimented.
right, and I mean, I'll tell you one event that was kind of the event that revealed to me that maybe religious life isn't my calling. So, I know myself pretty well in terms of that. I really love being a teacher. And so I remember one day I asked one of the Dominicans, "Hey, could I be a teacher at the nearby parish or school?" And this Dominican told me, "That's what you want to do." And at first I thought like, "Oh, that kind of sucks. Like that's kind of mean." And I realized like, no, it actually makes sense within the framework of religious life, right? Like they know your talents and how you want to use them, but they ultimately decide. The brothers ultimately decide how you live your life. So, for example, let's say that I really wanted to do work on the papacy and theology and philosophy. But then they say, actually, Swan, we need you to be a priest down in Puerto Rico and spend the rest of your life there and learn Spanish along the way.
Yeah.
That I would have to accept that. And for
Yeah.
me, like knowing that I have a strong draw towards teaching and for me that's where I think my heart really is. Now somebody might say, well, Swan, of course the Dominicans are going to let you be a teacher and study the papacy and philosophy and theology. But then one of my brothers kind of asked me, like, in principle, if the order asked you not to do that, could you follow? And I noticed in my heart,
Yeah.
I was like, this doesn't feel right, And so I'm like, at
Yeah.
that point, then that's where the inauthenticity comes in.
So, because you have your talents, you know what you want to do with them, but maybe the order needs you to do something else that may line up with your talents. It may not, but like,
Exactly.
dude, you got it. Like, this is what we need done. You got to do that. You're the
Right.
guy. Oh, yeah. Okay. I really like that. You mentioned something, you know yourself. How did you Talk about how you knew yourself going in, and what process did you kind of like use to develop? What events in your life helped you know yourself? I think that's an important aspect in today's life.
Yeah, I think I spent a lot of time in introspection, and even in my prayer life, I'll spend a lot of time just quietly thinking about, who I am in Christ and
Okay.
what gifts and talents he's given to me. And, always just being willing to follow him wherever he leads me. But at the same time, though, like there are certain things that I know and I feel like God has definitely called me to be. So obviously, one thing is I really love public speaking. I really love to study the scriptures and philosophy and theology. So, this obviously felt like a natural fit, the kind of stuff that I'm doing right now. And becoming Catholic was a huge risk for me. But I said, God, I'm going to follow you because I think this is where you're leading me. And I was convinced, right? So, um, those are just some examples, but I would say it's a really lifelong, if you will, meditation where I think I have a pretty good grasp of who I am, and I trust that God could show me otherwise. Let's say, God says, Swan, actually, you're not really much of a philosopher and theologian. You're more of a biblical scholar, or you're not much of a biblical scholar, Swan. You're more of a counselor, a therapist, right? Maybe that's where He might lead me one day. Um, I mean, I'm totally open to that possibility. But as
Hmm.
of now, in this kind of lifelong meditation, if you will, this is where I think I am.
Uh-huh. Awesome. That's great. And so, yeah, absolutely lifelong. You thought it's been a lot of meditation throughout your life, acknowledging not only strengths and talents, but also shortcomings and like what
Hmm.
you wouldn't necessarily be the best at. And kind of having that sort of, let's call it radical honesty to, uh, to acknowledge something and then say like, all right, I'm either going to work on this or like I'm going to avoid that and focus on something better, even if I want to do something where I'm not strong at it. Yeah, cool. I guess that kind of plays into, you mentioned your second reason for discerning out was an inauthenticity of
Yeah.
being a Dominican. So you said that you really liked the habit, the way it looked. I know Matt Frad has talked about like, dude, the habit, beards and
Hmm.
like the look of various religious organizations. Like that's certainly a draw, and it can be an initial draw, which it sounds like it was for you. But then after that, there needs to be something deeper. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so the habit, it was attractive and all that, but I think the main thing for me about the habit was that it is in itself a ministry, and that's what I
Okay.
really loved about. That's what I really missed about being a Dominican. The ministry of the habit, both to the person and to others. But obviously, like the things that led me to the order were much more substantial than that. And if it was just as shallow as, oh, the habit looks cool, right, and that's why I'm entering the order, then they would fish that out.
Yeah. Well, that was going to lead my next question, which was like, well, what other habits look cool? Like, did it need to be the Dominicans, So why did you choose the
Hmm.
Dominicans instead of anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, so one is that I think St. Thomas Aquinas was a huge attraction and draw
Which you
for
said,
me,
yeah.
right? My
Yeah.
confirmation saint.
Uh-huh.
The other thing is also how their focus is on preaching. And, when I was a Baptist, I also was familiar with preaching. I went around to different churches and conferences and did that as a lay person. So the idea of being an evangelist, of being a preacher, and how that's the charism of the order, that really attracted me. And then also the academic side of the order and how it tends to be more orthodox than, let's say, other religious congregations and orders. So those things really attracted me. And then in general, then there was the attraction to religious life.
Hmm.
And you put all those together, and that's what led me in.
Gotcha. Cool, cool. Um, you talked about how painful holiness is.
Oh yeah.
Can we talk about that for a second? When I was younger, I remember some like the phrase that stuck with me was like, God is like a sculptor. He's
Yeah.
chiseling away that stone to reveal the beauty underneath, a great sculpture out of marble. But like he's chiseling away bits of the block, and
Hmm.
that can be kind of painful and hurts. So as God's chiseling away parts that are not beautiful on you, like
Mm.
he's taking a hammer and he's taking and just knocking stuff off. So that can really hurt. But what's revealed afterwards is a beautiful sculpture. Can you talk some more about that?
Yeah, I mean, so the path to holiness it usually begins by a recognition that you're not as good as you think you are. And for a lot of people, including myself, I'm sure for all human beings, that's a really painful realization when you have the desire to be good, to be holy, and then you have the Spirit tell you and directly in a loving way, you could be better, right? And it's not like a kind of judgmental, like, oh, you could be better. It's a kind of like you're called to something greater, and right now you're not living to your full potential, you
Hmm.
know. And so that first kind of, let's say, block, that first punch to the ego, right? That's the initial pain, right? And then as you go into the process of mortification, as you try to detach, let's say, from the comforts that you have, the things that hold you back from holiness, even like really small things that you don't think are significant. So for example, one thing I realized was without my phone, so usually at night, I'll be watching like, dumb, funny YouTube videos or something to help turn my mind off, right?
Right there with you.
Yeah, and it helps. But then you can see how that might be an impediment to holiness, because when you really do need to think about the day and reflect on it, when you really do need to be in the silence, you've dispositioned yourself, you developed a habit, if you will, of just going straight to noise and distraction. And that can be an impediment to holiness, because then what happens is you're not trying to be, well, and I'm not saying that it's always bad or automatically bad, or shame on you, right, Alex and Swan, for doing this. But I mean, it can be an impediment, right?
Hmm.
Or so just, and these little things that we think are harmless, they can end up being a lot more spiritually significant than we realize. So realizing then, like, the little sacrifices that amount to holiness, that's really difficult to
Yeah.
accept.
Yeah.
um I guess the maybe the last thing that I'll mention too is, um, you know, as you pointed out, God chiseling away at the block, right? So it's not only, for example, you realizing that you're, let's say, not as good as you think you are, and you having to make the little sacrifices, but it's also realizing maybe you don't know God as well as you think you do. And maybe God is saying, with your life, hey, actually, Swan, I called you here to discern for a little bit with the Dominicans to learn more about yourself. But Swan, I'm actually calling you to be, I don't know, a consecrated virgin. Or Swan, maybe I'm calling you to be married, right? And you're like, wait, God, no, wait, this wasn't the plan. You were so clearly leading me here. Now you're sending me mixed signals. God, what are you doing? And it's like, no, I mean, God being the Lord, he has the right to decide, right? To
Hmm.
maybe lead you to a place for a time and then lead you out of it. And so to have the feeling that it's not really, I think, like, when we think we know God, as human beings, our knowledge of things is very controlling. It's very limiting, right? So if I think I know you, Alex, right? And let's say you do something that I wasn't expecting, one that could make me feel offended, because I'm like, oh, no, my knowledge limited Alex to just being this type of guy. Well, when we think we know God, we also limit God in a way, right? So, I mean, we can know God, that he's good, that he's loving, but the way that he shows that love and that goodness to us, it might not be the way that we expect, right? So, if you will, God's love language might be different than how we receive love, but that isn't something bad or something to dread. Part of Christian maturity is accepting that and growing with him.
Hmm. Uh, so on that note about like knowing God, um, I think something, given that we have the big history of Thomas Aquinas in the West, this
Hmm.
idea of like very thorough and robust scholarly thought regarding the divine, what we can and cannot know, it kind of leads us toward, I'm going to learn as much as I can about God. And then we focus on the true and ignore the beauty.
Right.
So I kind of want to like mix this in with the thought of the true, the good, and the beautiful, the three transcendentals. One thing I've really appreciated in Eastern Catholicism is their focus on the mystery of God.
Mm.
That they're, you know what? Instead of focusing on how much we can know, let's focus on how much we can appreciate the mystery of God first. And then from there, what can we know?
Mm.
Again, our base, it's like a shift in base. I'm not focusing on what I know, I'm focusing on the mystery first. Um, that's something that I'm really working on, especially since I've started this podcast. Just like this is something that I need to grow in: mystery, beauty,
Hmm.
uh, kind of similar to you. I think I told you that like I just started this by like reading the Second Vatican Council documents, kind of focused on the true stuff. What can I know? Okay. Um, and that's led, at least in my mind, to like a detriment in the beautiful, that I'm lacking in that side of Christianity and the expression of my religion. It sounded like when you were talking that you kind of maybe your experience is similar to mine, where you were very academically minded, you can defend the papacy, but then when you were in adoration, you had to turn your brain off and just listen to your heart. Could you talk some about that?
Yeah, I mean, it was funny because, I'd read the Summa on, transubstantiation, and I think about like things like, when I'd be before the Blessed Sacrament, things like the non-locality of the Eucharist, the non-locality of the real presence, and I'd be
What a
sitting
great
there.
buzzword.
I'd be looking at the Blessed Sacrament, and my mind would be trying to figure out, okay, what's the best way for me to articulate to myself and to others the non-locality? And I'm like, wait a minute, this is this is not what adoration should be for, right? I mean, it's possible to have an intellectual encounter with the Lord through the Blessed Sacrament. I'm not saying that, when you go to adoration, you can't be thinking about things in the Summa, right? But the way I was going in was I was using the intellect. The intellect was becoming a distraction, right? Because I mean, the sacrament can definitely lead you into deeper intellectual meditation and truth, right? But you have to approach it on its terms, right? You have to approach the Lord on His terms.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, I think the best way to articulate, I guess, the conflict between the mind and the heart is just to think about how we relate with persons.
Okay.
So, for example, like Alex, I can know certain facts about you. I can know that, you run a podcast and, you run Generation Vatican II and all that. But I need to know you as a person. So you also have personality aspects. You have a heart. You have wants, needs, fears, desires. And so the same, I guess, when we think about our relationship with the Lord, right? And I remember too, this was something that the Dominicans very much emphasized, because especially with it being an academic order, this is the danger, right? That with our intellect, we try and control God, and we manipulate God, and we use the intellect to kind of poke and prod. But that's not how God wants to be treated, if you will. That's not how any person wants to be treated. People want to be received. They want to be, in a way, non-judgmentally received and fully seen for who they are. And I think the sacrament, of the adoration, what it's trying to do is the Lord, by being displayed in the monstrance, is saying, in a way that doesn't imply any lack in Himself, I want you to see me, receive me, and especially how when we receive the Eucharist, we receive the body, blood, soul, divinity of Christ. We receive the substance. We receive everything that He is. We are called then to receive, just as if you're with a person, it's not about you talking over the other person. It's not about you thinking in and out of the person. That's not how a relationship works. There's an aspect that's really important of receiving the other person. And so I realized that like the intellect is really good at receiving information, right? Certain facts of the other person, but that's not all that you are, right? And so I need to also receive the heart. I need to also receive the deepest, inmost reality of the person.
So that's terrific. Thank you. To try and like do this, like we talked about at the beginning of the interview. So that's how we're supposed to look at our relationship with God, and then that should inform, my marriage. But we're
Mm.
going to do it in reverse order here. uh, so like my wife, whom I've known for 2 decades now, like yeah, I could go out with very little preparation and find a great Christmas present for her. For those who are watching this sometime in the future, where we're recording this a couple days before Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
So I could go out and get a Christmas present and like, okay, I know she's going to like that and I know she's going to like that, but I know she's not going to like this. And part of that is informed by my knowledge of talking with her and knowing she likes red, vice blue, and all that jazz. But
Mm-hmm.
also just like having known the person and being with her and speaking with her and knowing the person, right? And that's kind of where we can talk about Christianity as it's not a a playbook or a rule book for how to act in a moral manner, but rather
Mm,
it's a relational aspect with a God, the only God,
right.
creator. So if we view it as a relationship, then all of a sudden the moral rules make sense as just like manifestations of how to properly act in such a loving relationship with another person, three
Hmm.
persons. So, excuse me. There's a bit of that. There's a bit of that good in the relationship, this beauty in two people knowing each other, which can then manifest itself as truth. Okay, cool. Um, the last thing I wanted to say when we were talking about this, it seems like there's a, I don't want to say that it's in vogue now, but like some people are leaving the Latin church in favor of an Eastern church.
Mm,
Partially because of like what I said to start this whole topic right now, which is like in Eastern Catholicism, they have a different view of the relationship with God,
yeah.
um, as well as other aspects, liturgical, blah, blah, blah. Uh, but as far as like the relationship with God, when you were talking about going to adoration, there's, I'm sure he's going to love this. There's Trent Horn and there's St. John Vianney. Okay. So Trent Horn, when he goes to adoration, I've heard that he goes to adoration and he puts in his earbuds and he listens to like lectures on astrophysics because that helps him like recognize the power of God. Okay.
Mm, mm,
But then there's St. John Vianney, who famously said, like, oh, well, how do you spend 5 hours in adoration? What are you doing in there? And he's like, I look at him and he looks at me.
hmm.
And it's like, okay, we have, you could say there's the truth and there's the beauty. There's the knowledge and there's the personal relationship. And I don't want to say that transform is lower or less accurate, but it helps him based on who Trent is.
Right.
And I think we could say that St. John Vianney is what we should all aspire to. That is more a let's say it this way. That's more a contemplative form of prayer than a meditative form of
Mm,
prayer, right? Um, so even within the Latin tradition, the Latin church,
mm.
we have this form of like knowing beauty and mystery, although we do tend to focus a lot in the Aquinas tradition of knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that we talked about when we were with the Dominicans was a lot of the Dominicans were stressing that Aquinas, our older brother, he wouldn't want to be known as much as he is for his intellect because he was a very mystical man. He really was very deeply rooted in the sacrament and had mystical experiences. I mean, so much so that near the end of his life, he realized that his work is straw compared to the true mystery of God. And so I think that and when you mentioned Trent Horn, it made me think of something else. So for example, two things. So personally, for me, it's funny because Trent listens to like astrophysics lectures. For me, books on like the historical Jesus and New Testament studies, that's what does it for me because in a way, by knowing the history and the facts, it fills in the story for me, and it's a tool for my imagination when I take it to prayer and I look at, let's say, when I'm doing Lectio Divina and thinking about meditating upon a story or a passage, it helps me flesh it out in a richer way. But the other thing I want to stress too is that, one thing we learned with the Dominicans was that everybody has their way to holiness. Everybody has their spiritual contemplative practice. So, for example, like I think it was Saint Jose Maria Escriva who said basically, look, the church has this treasure house, a storage house of all these different prayers and meditations that you can do, but only pick a few. Pick the ones that are right for you. So, for
Yeah.
example, sometimes people feel bad if they're like, actually, like, I really feel something more with the Divine Mercy Chaplet than, let's say, the Jesus Prayer. And it's like, yeah, and that's okay. Like, what matters for a spiritual practice is does it increase your love of God and does it make you holier, right? And the two are connected, obviously. So, for example, I think it's okay for Trent to be Trent and for Saint John Vianney to be Saint John Vianney, right?
Mhm.
Um, because I think one of the dangers, especially I saw this in religious life, some of the brothers would have these really kind of amazing, elaborate prayers. And then I would go in with my pen and journal and just write my thoughts and pray. And I'd be like, oh, am I not doing this good enough or whatever? And it's like, no. What matters is, does it increase your holiness and love of God?
Yeah. So when I came back to Catholicism, I got really into praying the rosary, and I would pray the rosary when I was driving to work in the morning, and sometimes I would even pray the rosary also on my way back. I had a long commute, and I was like, okay, this is like a time when I can just focus on praying to God. And in the past couple of years, I've actually kind of dropped off doing that in favor of the Liturgy of the Hours. Part of my exposure doing this podcast was the beauty of the Liturgy of the Hours. I got really into it, and my job got really busy again. So now, actually what happens now is I'll wake up to go to work, and my wife will send me morning prayer on a text message, like on a YouTube link. So I can like play it through my car stereo as I'm driving to work, and I can pray morning prayer as I go to work. Again, kind of trying to like make use of this commute, not because that's the preferable way to do it, but because it's a time when I can dedicate to God. So I've traded like one prayer form for another one. So I've kind of gone like that. And when I started out doing all this stuff with Mary, I was like, this is good, but I find myself a little more drawn to St. Joseph. And like that has helped me, especially as my son has been born. Like, you know what? Nope. I need to go outside. I need to work in the yard. I need to, pick up the dog. Went out there and did his business. I need to make sure the lawn is clean so that the kid can play out there. I need to fix this, fix that, hang up the bikes, blah, 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 do stuff, and that's a little more St. Joseph than Mary, Mother of God. So like these things, this is all just kind of tying back to what you said about like, pick a few dedications, devotions that work for you and stick with those. There are a bajillion novenas out there. Don't get lost in the sauce, man. Yeah, absolutely. Cool. So I think we've talked about how you were getting into it, the Dominicans. We've talked about how you were leaving. We talked a little bit about your experience in there. So what was it like when you were in there with the Dominicans? First off, administratively, structurally, like you lived in a monastery, you had a cell. Like, were you sleeping on straw? Were you eating 3 meals a day? Was it bread and water? Like, what was your life like in the monastery with the monks?
So, the house that we were staying at, for us, since we're, so there's a distinction between monks and friars, right?
Okay.
And so Dominicans are friars. So we stay not in a monastery, but in a priory.
Okay.
Now, I think if for like the Dominican sisters who are like cloistered, so they spend their whole life praying and they're kind of closed off from the rest of the world, I think theirs would be called a monastery, right? Because it kind of fits more the mode of a monk. But anyway, as Dominican friars, we were staying in a priory called St. Dominic's in Denver, and it was a very comfortable facility. I mean, we had 3 meals a day. We were well fed, taken care of. And the thing is, with the Dominicans, as time has passed, so when the order was originally founded under Saint Dominic, the stress of poverty very much looked more like a Franciscan, right, like a stereotypical Franciscan. But as time passed, I think a lot of the brothers started realizing we need technology in order to do the mission of preaching. So, for example, with social media, we can't be the type of people who say we can't have a laptop and mic and lighting or whatever. We need to use whatever we can. So hence, you have things like the Thomistic Institute, Father Gregory Pine, and others. So now poverty has been conceived more of in terms of simplicity and sharing all things in common. So, for example, nobody had their own car. We had a sheet where we have to fill out when we were using the car. We had to check with our brothers to see, are you using the car this afternoon? Can I use it? Blah, 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 in negotiating. The other thing that we had to do was, we didn't have our own cell phones, at least for the novices. The senior members, the established members, if you will, they could use their cell phones, but we had to share one cell phone. And so if somebody was using it for a phone call, we had to accept that. If somebody had to use it for as a GPS, we had to accept that. But basically, we prayed 4 times a day. So we prayed morning prayer, we prayed midday prayer, We did evening and then night prayer. And I think all of them except midday prayer were sung. And we would, have somebody on the we have somebody on the organ playing, and it'd be really beautiful. Um, and depending on the day of the week, usually we would have classes on like the history of the order, the history of religious life in general, or like the liturgy of the hours. We'd learn about the history of it, or Vatican II. We'd learned about the popes and that sort of thing. And on Wednesdays, we would go out to our ministries. So some of us would go to the women's homeless shelter, some of us would go to the other shelter that was co-ed. And Fridays were like our free days, so we could go out and do what we wanted, but we had to be there for prayer.
Uh-huh.
Saturday was almost the same thing, except usually Saturday was like a fun activity day, so we'd go out and do something like go to a garden or visit visit some other brothers or what have you. And then Sunday was obviously for mass and just relaxation.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Very cool.
Mm.
So I like the idea of how structured it was, but it still like made time for personal space. There's this idea of poverty within the 21st century, and understanding that like, hey, this is the way the world is now. This is the way we got to act. So how can we adjust to still fit our vocation and our way of life, and let's say make use of the advances of the technological era? Okay. How did it actually look to like call up the Dominicans and say like, hey, thinking about joining?
Yeah. Well, what you got to do first is you have to email the vocations director. And if you go on the web, so, there are different provinces in the United States. There's the Eastern province, Central province, Western province, and Southern province, right? And so depending on which province you want to join, you're not confined to just the local province. So for example, I could have applied to the Western province. I could have applied to the Eastern province, right? You apply to a province and you reach out to the vocations director, and they usually have the email and link and everything on the website of the province. And, he'll say, okay, come to a come and see, right? And so a come and see is like when they kind of, it depends on where it is. Sometimes I don't think they usually have it at the novitiate house or priory itself, but they might have you visit another priory or like the head of operations to see like what's going on, how they live their lives. It's a fun weekend where you get to hang out with them and, pray and, live out the life. And so you do that. And then from here, some provinces vary. So I had to visit, I think, 3 houses before you ask for the application. So the application's not like you go on the website, you fill out the PDF or the Word doc, and then you send it in. It's you go to other houses and other communities with Dominicans, and the vocations director is usually there to guide you along and to show you around. And the house has to give you the thumbs up. And they're like, okay, yeah, we like this guy, right? And then you go to another house, and they also tell the vocations director, hey, we like this guy. Eventually, if you seem like a good fit, you have a long phone call with the vocations director where he asks you like very like personal but important questions related to like canon law and other things to make sure that, okay, let's say that canonically speaking, you can't, receive, be admitted into an order. Then they have to know that.
Yeah.
And so, you have this long phone call, then they email you the application. You do the application. It involves like medical history, autobiography. You write an 11-page spiritual autobiography of yourself. And you do other things too, like get letters of recommendation, and you fill out questions about finances and all that.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Okay. Thank you. So I'm imagining like this was just like a house on a street, this priory, right?
Yeah, it's funny because some priories are kind of in their own place, and they're kind of nice and secluded in a way. Other priories, like the St. Dominic's priory, is literally in the middle of a neighborhood. So all the shenanigans that go with the neighborhood, we heard and we saw,
Okay, so did you ever like get TP'd or egged or anything? Like were the local teenagers messing with those monks down the street?
Well, so I didn't experience anything of that sort. So we had some experience. So one of the senior members of the community, he was taking some groceries out of the trunk of his car, and some like teenagers were driving by on like a scooter, and they said something like an expletive. They dropped the F-bomb on him, and he just kind of was so confused and laughing about it. But it was kind of funny. I'm just like, teenage shenanigans. Yeah.
Nice,
Yeah.
nice. That's
I
funny.
should mention though, so with the application process, the very last thing is that they fly you out to the head of the center of operations, the headquarters. So for the central province, that would have been Chicago. They do an extensive interview process in person, multiple rounds of friars, and then at the very end of the process, they deliberate, and then they call you into the room and tell you if you got in or not. So that is
Oh,
the final process. Yeah.
and how long does that usually take? Like their deliberation?
Oh, it takes like an hour or even less. So I think for me it took like they took 40 minutes maybe just looking over everything. Yeah.
Did they tell you no, or did you come back and, hey, if through my discernment process, this isn't, was it kind of like a mutual thing?
Oh, so this is like, me being admitted into the novitiate,
All right, I'm
right?
tracking
So
now.
yeah,
Gotcha.
yeah, they told me that I was admitted into the novitiate, yeah, in person with all the friars in the room. And then after they told me, they measured me for my habit, which felt felt like, like a Disney movie ending or something. It felt really special.
Nice. Okay, so what are your views on like the number or percentage of the population that actually goes into some form of religious life or even like considers it, discerns it?
Oh, like incredibly small. I would say like maybe and this is me just doing a rough estimate, right? I have no facts or statistics to back up anything I'm saying at this point,
Uh-huh.
but just a hunch, right? It'd be like 5%.
Even think about it.
You're right, right.
Okay.
Yeah, 5%.
Do you think that is an appropriate number, or should it be 100% go through a discernment process?
You know, um, okay, are we talking about the Catholic population? That is, right? That's the population, that's the base.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
Let's
okay.
let's limit
So
ourselves to the Catholics. Sure.
yeah, in terms of Catholics, then it would be higher, obviously. So it would be
Okay.
something like 10% maybe or
Well,
20%. The
it's gonna be higher.
10%.
Yes, probably 80% actually think about it of real Catholic. No. Okay, so not much more.
Yeah. Yeah.
Think about it then. Should this be something that everyone is seriously considering?
Um, I think everybody should consider or think about religious life. Like give it a fair shake, even if you're convinced that you want to be married and you want to have kids and, go down that vocation. You should give it a shot. Like just, seriously, because you might be surprised what God will do with that. Um, and also I think that I think it's such a tragedy that people think like, if you go in with the idea that let's say, oh, monks and friars, they're called to live out poverty, chastity, and obedience. I'm just called to kind of live out the commandments in a very vague way. I mean, literally, like all the men that I've known who have gone through vocation, who have gone through priestly discernment or religious life, all of them have said they came out as better men. Right? And so I really do think it's something essential because you also get to see a side of the church that a lot of people miss out on, the richness of it. So, for example, you talked about how a lot of people love the Eastern Church, right, because of the liturgy and the beauty and the aesthetics. When I was living as a friar, we would also have things with icons and have really beautiful prayers, and it felt really contemplative. And I think a lot of people they think, oh, like the Catholic Church is so dull and the spirituality is so rigid, and they get attracted to, let's say, new age spirituality stuff or whatever,
A
and they're
rock
like,
band church.
right, they want to be like spiritual, not religious. And I'm
Yeah.
like, no, like you need to look into religious life in the Catholic Church because it's, if you will, like uber Catholic and uber spiritual in a good way, right? And so I think it shows you a side of the church that a lot of people miss out on. This how beautiful and wonderful it can be.
Mhm. And so, like you said, like it made you feel like more of a complete person and like you knew yourself better. It had helped you develop that much more. Okay. So everyone needs to at least consider it.
Yeah.
At least speak with a spiritual, first off, get a spiritual director
Yeah.
and talk with them about it, you know? Okay, cool. Um, so spiritual fatherhood led you into it. You gave your 3 reasons why you got out, and now you are out. Are you, because this is not a guarantee, have you discerned marriage?
Um, Depends on what you mean by have you discerned marriage, right? So is it like on the radar? Sure.
Okay.
Um, as is like maybe being a consecrated virgin, that's also on the radar.
Mhm.
Um,
Because that's not something that's even thought about less. Like,
yeah,
oh, I could be like a regular person and just consecrate my virginity to God still and like be an accountant, you know? Like
yeah, right.
no one thinks that's an option, you know? But it is. So
Hmm.
please, where are you now? As much as you're willing to say.
Yeah, I'm right now in I'm right now trying to work on myself, as cliche as
Okay.
that sounds, and to kind of grow in spiritual and intellectual and emotional maturity, all these things, because I think religious life showed me where I need to improve, and so I appreciate learning that. I'm not coming on to say I'm a perfect person, right? And in a particular way, it showed me where I need to grow. Um, but at the same time, though, I feel like this might be weird to say, but like the balance of probabilities, so using my head again, I'm just kind of like, well, the balance of the probabilities is probably that I'm going to end up married. Um, and that doesn't sound like a very enthusiastic endorsement, right? But I'm just saying, like, that's probably what's going to happen. And so I'm kind of like, okay, God, because I think one of the dangers is sometimes, if we discern aimlessly. So, for example, we just allow God to, we allow our discernment to be really vague. So we're just like, yeah, I'll do God's will. But we don't ever think about, like, oh, what if God's will is specifically this? Right. And then when it gets really vague, you can start allowing yourself to escape with certain things. But for example, let's say that maybe you know that you're not probably going to be married, right? But you're still open to the possibility, right? So then, you know, discern as if you're going to have to one day take care of a wife and kids. Live your life not as a kind of sloppy, couch potato, but really think about like, oh, I need to make my house presentable for people. I need to make myself presentable, right? So keep up good hygiene, that sort of thing, right? I think when we have a specific mode of discernment, or at least we're modeling our life around, should this come to pass, I will be ready for it. That's a good way to go about, I think,
Mhm.
discerning things.
Okay, so you talked about like what discernment led you into the Dominicans. You talked about what discernment led you out of it. Not only like your reasons and everything, but also what the process looked like. Thank you for that. And now you've thrown this other term in there, discerning aimlessly.
Yeah.
How would you've cautioned against it. If someone's sitting here like, well, I might be discerning aimlessly, like what would that look like? What would you say, like, nah, man, like you're discerning aimlessly. That's what you're doing and you need to stop it. What would you look for?
Yeah. So usually when I mean by discerning aimlessly, it has things like laziness attached to it, or it has things like convenient vagueness. So, for example, oh, yeah, I'm going to follow the will of God, right? And then, but you never consider the possibility. What if God is calling you to, let's say, something particular, something specific, something that might make you uncomfortable? And the thing is, the whole point of a vocation is to increase your chance of getting into heaven. That's what a vocation is for. That's why God has the natural office of marriage and the supernatural, office of religious life and priesthood, right? Because the idea is, look, like the goal of marriage between you and your wife and the kids that you have in that union is to get them to heaven and to have them help you get to heaven. So that's why, for example, when your kids are being a pain in the butt, right, that's actually helping you get into heaven because it's increasing your sanctification. You have to practice holiness, you have to practice virtue. um, if I'm in religious life, the same principle holds true. My brothers are in a way sanctifying me and helping me grow. And so I think that if you're discerning aimlessly, right, one thing is going to be laziness is going to be there, where you're just like, oh yeah, I'll follow the will of God. I'll use these kind of vague terms like, yeah, I trust in Him. I'll go wherever He leads me. But you don't actually then concretely do anything with it, right? So, for example, you don't, for example, for example, you have to concretely think about, okay, I don't know what my vocation is right now, right? That's not discerning aimlessly. That's just being honest, right? Maybe you're discerning openly, like, okay, maybe I'm called to marriage, maybe I'm called to religious life, maybe I'm called to another path, like being a consecrated virgin. So then start thinking about concretely, what would I need to do in order to flourish in those modes of life? And then that's how you avoid discerning aimlessly.
Yeah, nice. Good. Thank you. I like that. So you said discerning openly. And so the thought I had when you were talking about this is like there's a difference between uh a platitude.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to follow God. I trust God. It's kind of like a meaningless, vague statement.
Mm-hmm.
And being as specific as you should be and no more specific. Okay. So like I'm an engineer by training. And there's something you can over design, you can over specify a parameter, and it leads to problems down the road.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So like there is a certain amount of ambiguity that is comfortable and acceptable right now.
Mm-hmm.
And the point is to resolve those ambiguities as you get closer to the ultimate solution. No, I'm sorry, that's a bad phrase. The ultimate answer. How about that?
Mm-hmm.
So discerning openly versus discerning comfortably, discerning aimlessly. I really
Yeah.
liked that. Thank you,
Mm-hmm.
Swan. Cool. I do have a bit of a bone to pick with you. If I can claim that you're wrong about something and have you tell me why I'm an idiot. You said at the very beginning that being an altar server was like your first step toward discerning into the Dominicans. Yeah?
Yeah.
And
Spiritual
then you
fatherhood. Mm-hmm.
and then you said the purpose of being an altar server is to prep people, to prep boys into the priesthood. And I disagree with that.
Mm.
Okay. So here's why I think that. Within religious within holy orders, we have, the episcopacy, the bishops, we have the priesthood, which is, the fulfillment of the priesthood is the of being a bishop. We have the diaconate. There are minor orders, porter, I forgot what the other ones are, whatever. But there are minor orders as well. And those have purpose in and of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They are not stepping stones to the bishop, to be a bishop, to the
Mm-hmm.
episcopacy. They can be, and there is a natural progression toward the fullness of the priesthood in the episcopacy, sure. But like, I haven't been able to solidify why that's the case, like why it should be that the lowest of the minor orders is just the first step toward being a bishop.
Mm.
It seems to me that like you can be a lector or a porter or whatever, and that's it, and that's
Yeah.
fine.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So when you say being an altar server is that like to prepare you to be a priest, or at least prepare you to discern being a priest,
Mm-hmm.
it just strikes me as wrong that you can't hang out and be an altar server and use that to serve God in this manner by serving at the altar and helping the priest in mass, and just have that be it. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't think that's necessarily problematic what you said. I think
Okay.
that the idea is that just normally speaking, right, that's what it was meant for, right? So
Okay.
during the Middle Ages and so forth, before we had the seminary system, usually what would happen with the priesthood is that you would have an apprenticeship sort of system. And so you'd have the guy be an altar server to help him kind of see, oh, do I want to do what my country, country parish priest is doing, right? And so that would be the way in which you would pass on who would be
Uh-huh.
discerning the priesthood. And as you said before, with like the ordained ministries, like the diaconate and the priesthood, and then eventually the elevation into the bishopric, right? I mean, someone could just be a deacon, right? And it's not like you have to level up to be a priest, right? Some people are really called to the diaconate. Um, so yeah, I have no issue with saying something like that, the nuance that you introduced.
Okay.
But I will say that this is little T tradition, right? Not big T tradition. I'm not saying this is how it always has to be in every place, right? But normally speaking, that's what the ministry of altar service is meant for.
Okay. All right. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So you're the guy who studied history. I'm not. So I didn't realize that seminaries are, let's call it, a relatively new invention.
Yeah.
Seminary back in the day was you threw a rock at the church, and now you're like your dad is making you go there and like serve with the priest as part of saying you're sorry. And not, hey, I kind of like this. I
Uh-huh.
think I'm going to be a priest when I grow. Or maybe you're the second son and you have no inheritance. Whatever.
Mm.
But like the seminary, quote unquote, was go be an altar server, figure out if you want to be a priest. I didn't know that. Okay, cool. Thank you. And then I also liked what you said about how maybe not theologically or ecclesiologically speaking, this is the natural ordering of being an altar server, but in the normal sense of the word, being an altar server is to prepare you for the priesthood. Okay. So with that hot take, can I get your thoughts on women being altar servers? Yeah, did you see that coming?
Alex, you're really trying to get me crucified here.
Yeah. All right. So what are your thoughts?
You know, it's something that I tolerate.
Okay.
Right. But my preference would be that, the altar servers are young men who are discerning the priesthood or open to discerning the priesthood.
Okay.
But I'm not going to I'm not going to really criticize people who do it differently or something like that. Yeah.
Okay. I appreciate that. Could you say a little more? What do you mean by you tolerate it?
As I said before, I think that the normal mode of what the altar server is supposed to be seems to be preparing young men for the priesthood, right?
Okay.
And I think it's really important that, if we want more men discerning the priesthood, we give them the opportunity to be close to the sacrament and preparing and helping the priest. And so I'm not saying, for example, that, having girl altar servers is the reason why we're having a vocations crisis. That's not what I'm saying at all. But also, I think, if I'm not mistaken, like, if it's the case that you need an altar server, but there really aren't any like eligible young men to do it, then yeah, I mean, then we can have, women step into that role as altar servers. But as I said before, I think the sign of what it's supposed to be is preparation for the priesthood.
Okay. So would it be fair to say Suan Sonna thinks there shouldn't be any female altar servers because there should be so many young boy altar servers that there just isn't any space? Like, if every church had 50 boys serving as altar servers, like, hey, a girl wants to be an altar server, like, cool, but like, when are we going to fit you in? These boys are like on their discernment to the priesthood. They're already signed up. I'm sorry, Susie. What would you say about that, maybe?
I mean, I think you would want to sit down and talk to the woman or the young girl who wants to, be an altar server, not just dismiss her offhand, and just kind of talk about, the reasoning why we prefer that usually young men are the ones who are doing altar serving in the church, but then also offer other ministries that where she can significantly contribute, such as like being a lectern, reading the scriptures, right, and doing that sort of thing.
So that's why I am like very hesitant to like agree with any statement that says that altar servers is for boys, because maybe being an altar server when she's 8 years old is how Susie realizes, you know what? I really like being a lectern or being a lector, reading the first reading at mass, or maybe she wants to then go on and be a CCD instructor. And like, that's how she finds within the church a good way to serve God. And that was brought about from her history being an altar server when she was a kid.
I mean, yeah, I mean, that's one possibility, right? To have her learn herself, right, and receive that information through that experience. But I mean, what if it doesn't amount to that? What if it amounts to, let's say, and I mean, this whataboutism can, happen all over the place, right?
Yeah.
But what if, suppose this, right? Suppose that she says, well, if I can do this, then why is the priesthood only male?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And I'm not saying that like that necessarily follows. And it's not like if I go to a church, I see a female altar server, I'm like, oh, okay, here we go. We're going against what Pope St. John Paul II said about women never being ordained to the priesthood, right? We're the slippery slope, right?
Yeah.
I'm just saying that like if we use the what about argument, then I'll use it in another way too, to just show that, it can go in all sorts of directions, right? So I think what we should focus on is just, generally speaking, what is having a theology and developing it of what is the ministry of the altar server for.
Okay, great. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. All right. So now that you're out, let's we can package that up nicely and leave it for the listeners. Thank you. I really appreciate you engaging me on that. The last thing I have about your time with the Dominicans, now that you're out and you have gained this wonderful influence from the Dominicans, what does your future academic career entail? Do you intend to pursue a master's or a PhD? And then maybe we could tie that into the future of intellectual Catholicism, your show.
Yeah, so I'd like to pursue a master's and a PhD. So I'm right now applying to grad schools, and we'll see how that goes. And let's see. And then, yeah, I mean that's what the future would hold. I'd eventually like to be a professor.
Okay, a professorship, nice. Are you applying to these programs at Kansas State again?
No, so Kansas State doesn't have like a philosophy master's or scripture studies department, obviously, because it's also a secular university, right? It's a public university. So I'm applying to, the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology in California, Berkeley, California, and I'm also applying to Harvard Divinity School. So we'll see how that goes.
All right. Rock on, dude. Well, best of luck in that endeavor. I really am excited about where you go with your future academic progresses, and then where that will take your show as well, which is, I mean, that's the way that I mostly engage with you, is watching your channel and watching your interviews with other people. Although now in prepping for this interview, I got signed up to academia.edu, and that's where I've been getting a lot of your papers. Cool. Hey, thanks, Suan. I really appreciate this discussion on discernment and your time with the Dominicans. It's meant a lot. On that note, regarding the Dominicans and discernment, do you have any closing thoughts?
Maybe I'll close with a story, right?
Okay.
So I forgot which saint it was. I think it was maybe Saint Faustina or some other saint. But basically, the story goes that Jesus appeared to the saint, this female religious, and Jesus said to her, I want you to do this thing for me, right? And in religious life, you have to always talk to your superior first, right? And so even though, the saint, Jesus was saying something like, I want you to do these penances, right? And so the saint was really excited. And so she went to her mother superior to ask for permission. And her mother superior said, absolutely not. You're not going to do these penances. And she's like, no, but the Lord told me to do it. It's like, no, I don't care. You're not doing these penances. And so the saint was really disgruntled and sad, and she walked out. And in the hallway, she saw Jesus again. And Jesus said, well done. You listened to me and you listened to your superior. And I think that I really believe that God led me to go into the Dominican order to see this way of life. And then when I found out that it wasn't for me, and I came to this understanding, and it's funny because I was so convinced that I'm meant to be a Dominican. And I think God very gently over 3 months said, no. And instead of feeling betrayed, like, God, why'd you let this happen? I kind of felt like that saint when she was in the hallway and she saw Jesus say, well done. You listened to me and you listened to your superior. For me, I think Jesus would be saying, like, well done. You listened to me when I led you in, and you listened to me when I led you out. And so I have no regrets.
That's a great story. Thank you. Thank you for ending with that. I appreciate it. Hey, where can people find you? You've got your YouTube channel, Intellectual Catholicism, website. What's your where can people contact you?
Yeah, so I have an academia.edu page just under my name. I have a YouTube channel and podcast called Intellectual Catholicism. And if you want to email me, you can reach out through iCatholicism@gmail.com. And I have a Patreon account if you want to support the work that my channel's doing.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Thank you, Suan. Thank you once again for coming on the show. I really appreciate this discussion. I hope you have a good rest of your weekend and a Merry Christmas.
Oh, yeah. Merry Christmas to you, Alex.
For more information, please visit the official Generation Vatican II website, generationvatican2.com. The Generation Vatican II Instagram and Twitter handles are @GenVatican2. If you have questions or comments, you can email me at generationvatican2@gmail.com. And if, after giving to your home parish, you think you'd like to support me, you can find my Patreon by searching for Generation Vatican II on Patreon. All donations will go back to support the podcast. These views are my own and in no way endorsed by the U.S. Navy. The Generation Vatican II theme song is titled Et Spes, composition, score, and performance by the musical genius of Brendan Flynn, whom you can listen to on Spotify or YouTube. Hope to see you next time. I'm Alex, and this is Generation Vatican II.